Tonight, a quiet announcement on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives marked the end of an era. There was no applause designed for television.
No dramatic exit. No viral confrontation.
Instead, there was something far rarer in modern American politics: reflection. Steny Hoyer, the longest-serving Democrat in the House, stood before his colleagues and said he would not seek re-election. At 86 years old, after more than 4 decades in Congress, one of the most experienced lawmakers in American history chose to step aside, not because he was defeated, not because he was forced out, but because he believed the institution he loved was drifting away from its purpose. And when someone who has spent a lifetime inside the machinery of American democracy says that, it deserves closer attention. Because this story is not just about retirement. It's about time. It's about power. And it's about what happens when experience confronts a political system that no longer behaves the way it once did. Tonight, we're going to talk about who Steny Hoyer is, why his departure matters, and what his words reveal about the state of Congress and the country itself. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand who Steny Hoyer is, not just by title but by time. Hoyer entered Congress in 1981 after winning a special election in Maryland. Ronald Reagan was president. Cable news was in its infancy, and the political culture of Washington operated under a very different set of assumptions. He didn't arrive as a firebrand. He didn't build his career on outrage. Instead, Hoyer became something increasingly rare in American politics, a legislator whose power came from patience, procedure, and persistence. Over the decades, he rose through the Democratic leadership, eventually serving twice as House Majority Leader under Speaker Nancy Pelosi. When Democrats were in the minority, he served as her deputy. When leadership changed in 2022, both stepped aside together, signaling, even then, that a generational shift was underway. What made Hoyer influential was not charisma, but credibility. In Washington, there is a difference between being famous and being effective. Hoyer belonged firmly to the second category. When Steny Hoyer announced his decision, he did so on the House floor, the very place where his career had unfolded for more than 40 years. He spoke not with celebration, but with regret. He described the House as an institution designed by the founders to reflect the will of the American people and to serve as a guardian of liberty and democracy. That language matters, because Hoyer was not talking about politics as spectacle. He was talking about politics as responsibility. He said his decision came with sadness, not because he would miss the power, but because he feared the House itself was no longer living up to its promise. That is not the voice of someone leaving comfortably. That is the voice of someone sounding an alarm. Hoyer reflected on how Congress functioned when he first arrived in 1981. Back then, ideological differences existed, but cooperation was not considered weakness. Members from opposing parties worked together. Legislation was negotiated, not weaponized. Disagreement did not automatically imply disloyalty. This is not nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It is a comparison and a warning. When lawmakers stop seeing each other as colleagues and begin seeing each other only as enemies, institutions decay from the inside. Hoyer's message was not partisan. It was institutional. And that distinction matters more now than ever. One of the most revealing moments in Hoyer's remarks was deeply personal. He recalled hearing a young senator named John F. Kennedy speak at his college in 1959. That moment changed his life. It inspired him to switch his major to political science, a decision that set him on a path from the Maryland State Senate to the halls of Congress. This is how political careers used to begin, not through branding, but through belief. Hoyer entered politics because he believed institutions mattered. Because he believed democracy required participation, patience, and principle. That worldview shaped his entire career. And it stands in sharp contrast to the political incentives that dominate today. Perhaps the most striking phrase Hoyer used was this: reluctant conviction. He said his reluctance came from concern, deep concern, that the House was no longer fulfilling the responsibility entrusted to it by the Constitution. He urged his colleagues to examine their conscience, to renew their courage, to remember why the first article of the Constitution exists at all. That is not rhetoric meant to trend. It is rhetoric meant to endure. Later, He spoke of a fear that the country was not moving toward greatness, but toward something smaller, more petty, more divided. When a man who has spent over 40 years inside the system says that it deserves to be taken seriously, Hoyer's retirement does not exist in isolation. It comes amid a broader debate within the Democratic Party about generational change. Younger lawmakers are pushing for new leadership. Voters are questioning longevity. And recent political events have reignited concerns about age and representation. This conversation intensified after President Joe Biden's debate performance in 2024, a moment that ultimately led him to step aside from the presidential race. Hoyer's decision reflects an acknowledgement of that reality. He has argued before that new energy and new ideas are essential for party survival. This is not retreat. It is transition. From a purely electoral standpoint, Hoyer's seat was secure. His Maryland district is solidly Democratic. In 2024, he won re-election with nearly 68% of the vote. This was not a man pushed out by voters. This was a man stepping aside by choice. That distinction matters, because it reframes his departure not as defeat, but as decision. Steny Hoyer's retirement is not about one seat in Congress. It is about what happens when institutional memory leaves the room. Experience cannot solve every problem, but its absence creates new ones. The question now is not whether younger leaders will rise. They will. The question is whether they will inherit a Congress capable of governing, or merely performing. There is a cost to experience leaving an institution, even when that departure is voluntary. Congress is not simply a collection of elected officials. It is a system built on precedent, memory, and informal rules that are rarely written down. Veteran lawmakers like Steny Hoyer carry something that cannot be transferred in a leadership vote or replaced by a viral moment. They carry institutional memory. They remember how crises were handled before the cameras arrived. They remember when compromise was not a scandal. They remember when losing a vote did not mean delegitimizing the system itself. When those memories leave, something subtle but significant changes. The institution becomes louder, but not necessarily wiser. Modern American politics rewards very different behavior than it once did. Attention is currency. Outrage is amplification. And governing often comes second to branding. This is not an accident. Cable news, social media, and fundraising algorithms have reshaped what success looks like for a lawmaker. Steny Hoyer built his career in a system where influence came from negotiation and trust. Many younger lawmakers are entering a system where influence comes from visibility and confrontation. Neither approach is inherently wrong. But when the balance tilts too far toward performance, governance suffers. And that is the tension underlying Hoyer's quiet exit. It would be easy to reduce this story to a conversation about age. But that would miss the point. Hoyer was not pushed out by voters. He was not losing elections. He was not unable to serve. Instead, he made a judgment about timing, about responsibility, and about what the moment required. That distinction matters. Because generational change is not simply about replacing older faces with younger ones. It is about whether the values of the institution are carried forward or quietly abandoned. One of the most striking aspects of Hoyer's remarks was his concern that the House is no longer fulfilling the founders' intent. The Constitution gives Congress extraordinary power, not for spectacle, but for stewardship. Article 1 was written first for a reason. The legislative branch was meant to be the closest to the people, deliberative, responsive, and accountable. When lawmakers treat that responsibility as secondary to short-term political advantage, the damage is cumulative. Hoyer's words suggest he sees that damage accumulating. For Democrats, Hoyer's retirement comes at a moment of strategic uncertainty. The party hopes to regain control of the House in the upcoming midterm elections. At the same time, it is navigating internal debates over leadership, messaging, and generational identity. Hoyer represents a wing of the party focused on institutional stability and procedural competence. His departure creates space, but also risk. New leaders bring energy. They also bring inexperience. The challenge is not choosing between old and new, but integrating both. In an era defined by dramatic resignations and explosive departures, Hoyer's exit feels almost out of place. There was no scandal.
No breakdown. No spectacle.
And that may be precisely why it matters. Sometimes the most consequential moments in politics are not the loudest ones, but the calm decisions made by people who know the system well enough to recognize when their presence is no longer enough to save it. Congress will continue. New members will be elected. Leadership roles will be filled. The machinery will keep moving. But something will be missing. The question is whether the next generation will rebuild the habits that once allowed the House to function, or whether those habits will fade into history. Institutions do not survive on rules alone. They survive on norms, and norms require people willing to protect them. Steny Hoyer did not leave with applause. He left with a warning. And warnings are easy to ignore, especially when they arrive quietly. But democracy rarely fails in dramatic fashion. It weakens slowly, through neglect, through cynicism, and through the normalization of dysfunction. When experienced voices step aside, what replaces them matters more than ever. Because the future of American democracy will not be decided by who leaves, but by who chooses to stay and how they choose to serve.